Let's take a look at example 5. Our first step is to factor our denominators. So, if I were to factor my first denominator, I would use the greatest common factor. You can pause here to factor. I would then have 1 over 2x parentheses x minus 1. I have a plus sign. I would factor my second denominator. You can pause here to factor using difference of squares. I would end up with 2 divided by 2x plus 1 and 2x minus 1. Now I would figure out what my least common denominator was. Don't forget, your least common denominator must contain all of the factors from your denominators. I have a 2 in my denominator, so I must have a 2 in my least common denominator. I have an x in my denominator, so I must have an x in my least common denominator. I have an x minus 1 in my denominator, so I must have an x minus 1. I have a 2x plus 1 in my denominator, so I must have a 2x plus 1 in my least common denominator. I have a 2x minus 1 in my denominator, so I must have a 2x minus 1 in my least common denominator. Now I can multiply in what's missing. From my first fraction, I am missing the 2x plus 1 and the 2x minus 1. In my second fraction, I am missing the 2x and the x minus 1. So I'm going to multiply in what's missing. Now I'm going to combine my fractions into 1. I end up with 2x plus 1, 2x minus 1. Notice I did not put the 1 in the very front because whenever you multiply by 1, it does not change your product. Plus 2 times 2x times x minus 1. All over my least common denominator, which would be 2x, x minus 1, 2x plus 1, 2x minus 1. Then I would go ahead and simplify using the distributive property and combining like terms. I'm going to simplify my numerator. As I'm simplifying my numerator, I'm going to multiply using the distributive property on steroids. So I have 2x times 2x. I end up with a 4x squared. I have a 2x times a negative 1. I end up with a negative 2x. I have a positive 1 times a 2x. I get a positive 2x. I have a positive 1 times a negative 1. I get a negative 1. I'm going to multiply 2 times 2x. So I put a plus sign, and I have 2 times 2 gives me 4, so I have 4x times x minus 1. All over, do not mess with your denominator. It is still 2x times an x minus 1 times a 2x plus 1 times a 2x minus 1. I'm going to continue to use the distributive property in my numerator so I can simplify. And I'm going to go ahead and combine like terms as I'm going. So as I'm working this problem, I can see that I have a negative 2x and a positive 2x that can be combined. And these are actually going to cancel each other out. So I have 4x squared minus 1. And then I distribute 4x times an x gives me a positive 4x squared. 4x times a negative 1 gives me a negative 4x. All over my least common denominator, which is 2x, x minus 1, 2x plus 1, and 2x minus 1. Then I'm going to combine like terms again. So I have a positive 4x squared and a positive 4x squared. I end up with an 8x squared. And I'm going to go ahead and write these in descending order. So I'm going to write my negative 4x next. and then I have my negative 1. I end up with 8x squared minus 4x minus 1, all divided by, I have my 2x, my x minus 1, my 2x plus 1, and my 2x minus 1. Now, if I were to try to do midterm to my numerator, I would see that there's no way that I could multiply these together to be able to get a 4. If I did 8 times negative 1, I would get a negative 8. If I try to factor it, I have factors 8 and 1. I have 2 and 4. And those are the only factors of 8. There's no way that I can subtract any of those to be able to get that middle term of a negative 4. So this is as far as I can take it. This is my answer. You do not have to multiply the factors of your denominator together to simplify that. The only one that must be simplified would be your numerator. Let's take a look at example 6. Don't forget, the first thing that we do is factor our denominators. So I have 8x over x squared minus 9. You can pause here while you factor using the difference of squares. You end up with 8x over x plus 3 and x minus 3. I'm going to bring down my plus sign. Then I look at my second fraction, and I notice that my x minus 3 in my denominator cannot be factored, so I leave it how it is. I end up with x minus 7 all over x minus 3, and I'm going to go ahead and put that one in parentheses. I'm going to write down my least common denominator. My first factor is x plus 3, so that must be in my least common denominator. My x minus 3 isn't contained in my first fraction and my second fraction. That is the same factor. So I'm going to make sure I write x minus 3 in my least common denominator. Now I'm going to look at my first fraction and notice that nothing is missing, so I do not have to multiply anything in. I'm going to look at my second fraction and notice that I am missing my x plus 3. So I'm going to have to multiply in an x plus 3 in my numerator, and I'm going to have to multiply in an x plus 3 in my denominator. Because we're multiplying in an x plus 3 into our numerator, and we already had a binomial there, we have to make sure we put this x minus 7 in parentheses. Now we can combine our fractions into 1. I end up with 8x plus parentheses x minus 7, x plus 3, all over my least common denominator, which is x plus 3 and x minus 3. Now I'm going to simplify my numerator using the distributive property and combining like terms. As I simplify this, I can see that I need to use the distributive property on steroids. I have 8x, and then I multiply x times x. I get a positive x squared. I have x times a positive 3. I get a positive 3x. I have negative 7 times x. I get a negative 7x. I have a negative 7 times a positive 3. I get a negative 21, all divided by x plus 3, x minus 3. Now I'm going to combine like terms, and I'm going to put it in descending order. So I'm going to have my x squared. Then I can combine my 8x, my 3x, and my negative 7x. 8 plus 3 gives me 11, minus 7 gives me a 4. So I end up with a positive 4x minus 21, all over x plus 3, x minus 3. Now I'm going to look to see if I can factor my numerator to see if I can simplify this even more. Looking at my numerator, I can tell I can do midterm. So I multiply my leading coefficient and my last term. I get a negative 21. Two factors that will multiply to give me negative 21 and subtract to give me 4 are a 7 and a negative 3. I divide by my leading coefficient of 1 and know that those do not reduce, so I can put my x in my denominator, and I end up with the factors x plus 7, x minus 3, all over x plus 3, x minus 3. Well, whenever I do that, now it's back to simplifying rational expressions. I have a factor in the numerator, and that same factor is located in the denominator. I can mark off the x minus 3 in my numerator and the x minus 3 in my denominator. My simplified rational expression is x plus 7 divided by x plus 3. And this is my answer. Let's take a look at another example. We're going to do the same thing that we did before. We're going to factor our denominators. I'm going to factor my first denominator using MIFTERM. You can pause here while you factor. I end up with 2 divided by x minus 3, x minus 3. I have a subtraction sign. I'm going to factor my second denominator using difference of squares. You can pause here while you factor. I end up with 5 divided by x plus 3, x minus 3. Now I'm going to get my least common denominator. Don't forget, for your least common denominator, every factor in your denominator must be taken care of. I have an x minus 3 in my first denominator, and I have that same x minus 3 in my second denominator, so I write it down one time. I have another x minus 3 in my first fraction that I do not have in my second fraction, so I must write down that factor. I have an x plus 3 in my second denominator that I do not have in my first denominator, so I must write that down. Now I'm going to multiply in what's missing. I can look at my first fraction and see that I need an x plus 3, so I'm going to multiply in an x plus 3 in my numerator and my denominator. I can look at my second fraction and see that I have an x minus 3 missing, so I'm going to multiply in an x minus 3 in my numerator and in my denominator. Now I'm going to combine my fractions into 1. I end up with 2 parentheses x plus 3 minus 5 parentheses x minus 3 all over my least common denominator of x minus 3, x minus 3, x plus 3. Now I'm going to simplify my numerator using distributive property and combining like terms. I'm going to distribute my 2. I get 2 times x, I get 2x. 2 times 3 gives me a positive 6. Negative 5 times x gives me a negative 5x. Negative 5 times negative 3 gives me a positive 15. All over my factor denominator, which remains x minus 3, x minus 3, x plus 3. Now I'm going to combine like terms. I can combine my 2x and my negative 5x. I get a negative 3x. And then I can combine my positive 6 and my positive 15. I get a positive 21. All over x minus 3, x minus 3, x plus 3. And I look at that and I can tell that I have a greatest common factor of a negative 3. So I'm going to go ahead and factor out a negative 3. I have negative 3 parentheses x minus 7. And now it's all over x minus 3, x minus 3, x plus 3. I look at my factors to see if anything can cancel. I don't have any factors in common that I can cancel from my numerator and my denominator. So my final answer is the one that has the simplified numerator and the factor denominator. Do not have a factored numerator because sometimes on the computer assignment it will count it wrong. Thanks for watching.